Today I'm going to share one of the craziest discoveries I had over the past couple of weeks if it comes to n8n and MCP. And no, I'm not talking about the AI agent module that everyone is talking about. I'm literally talking about turning your n8n into an MCP server that you can use inside of your applications. This is one of the most powerful things that I've implemented inside of mostly any of our agentic systems as of today, including voice agents. So I'm super excited sharing that with you. If you've ever tried working with MCPs, you probably know that you always had to have some sort of middleware or you needed to execute stuff locally on your computer. All of this is not necessary anymore using the method I'm going to show you right now, because you can literally just turn every single thing into an MCP server using n8n. And trust me if I say this is going to be a game changer, because you have such a crazy control of what you actually add into it that it's nearly impossible not getting any value out of this. And to know what to expect from this video, I'm going to show you what this whole MCP server on n8n is about, how you can leverage it and set it up locally, and some extra tips on goodies that I learned along the way to get more out of that than the average user. And if you don't know who I am, my name is Yannis and I run an AI agency called n8n, and we build voice agents from small businesses up to Fortune 200 companies. On the other hand, we run a community with now over 4,000 voice AI specialists that start their own business and start making a living, working from anywhere while living a life that is worth living. Now, to make sure you really understand what this whole thing is about, I'm going to start off with an example so you really get a feeling of what this whole thing is about, because you probably have heard of MCP as of yet. If not, I have also videos on my channel available, and there are tons of videos on YouTube in general, so I recommend checking them out as well. But if you've never heard of it, simply imagine MCP as some set of rules that help your AI agents to communicate with external services. It's basically like a language, so that they think that these kind of tools can communicate with your agents in a very streamlined way without you building out things completely custom from scratch over and over again. Now, the way to make this work is you obviously need to have some sort of agentic system where you can talk with an MCP server, right? So that can be anything like Cursor, for example, or Claude, or any desktop application that supports MCP. And in our case, because it is simple, we're going to use Cursor because the majority of people are using that already. And if you don't know about Cursor, it is basically an IDE that is just built on Visual Studio, and it's available for free, so you can simply download it. Once you downloaded it, it looks something like this. Obviously now I have already a couple of things available in here, and I'll also guide you through what this whole thing is about. But let's, for example, say we're gonna have a chat with our agent, right? So inside of Cursor, we have this little pane up here. We can start a new chat, and now we can actually chat with an AI that has access to the MCP server that we created. So what I did is I went into my n8n, I created this MCP server on n8n, and I imported it here in Cursor. So this chat has basically access to my n8n setup. So what I can do now is I can literally just use that to whatever this n8n MCP server supports. And I've built in a feature or a tool that is called cat jokes. And whenever I basically just want a cat joke, I can send in a name for the cat, and the AI or the MCP server basically uses that to generate a cat joke. So what I'm going to do now is I just tell it, use your n8n tools to call the tool called cat jokes and launch it with a cat name called Adam. So all I did is I basically just instructed it now to use my MCP server, because obviously I have no context set up right now. So I just wanted to literally just use the tool call and basically fetch it. And you can now see that it tries to do a list tool call with input cat jokes to my n8n server that acts as an MCP server. And you can see that it actually found something. You can see here as well, it's the ID, and it basically just tells you some more information. And it found it, and it can execute it now. So I literally run this tool, and this is actually calling and workflow on my n8n server. And you can see it says, why did Adam the cat get kicked out of the garden? Because he wouldn't stop eating the forbidden houseplants. It basically literally just returned a cat joke, as you can see here as well. It basically brings in the response. And this is the actual n8n scenario that is responsible for that. Very basic. You can see it's being executed by something. It has an OpenAI chat completion that just generates the cat joke, and it returns a response. And you can see right in here, it's literally nothing else than answer the user inquiry. So very basic system prompt, the most basic thing you can probably imagine. And then having a system prompt in here that basically fetches the cat name that we passed along inside of Cursor. And this is so damn cool because it's so powerful that you can literally just take your whole n8n instance and turn it into an MCP server that you can implement into your local setup. This is one of the most powerful things that I'm not just using for voice AI, but also for other things like ideation and creating scripts, etc. I, for example, hook this thing up inside of my Cursor that has access to predefined things about target audience, ICP, if you know about Poppy, basically something like that, but inside of Cursor, to enrich it with more information that works on n8n, so I can get live data from my actual environment or my CRM system into my local system and enrich the information based on ICPs, etc. There are tons of really cool things that you can leverage this for. So this is why I'm so excited of sharing that with you, because it's such a game changer if it comes to MCP, and probably one of the few really good ways on leveraging MCP in a more safe way while getting actual value out of it. Now, the big question you probably have is, how can you set this up, and is it difficult? And the answer is, it's not difficult, and I'm going to show you exactly how to set that up, and I will also provide you all of the templates that I used for making this thing work. Now, the first thing we need to do to get this whole thing up and running is obviously import a couple of n8n scenarios. And luckily for us, n8n already prepared a template that I kind of copied, and I just made a couple of small adjustments to it to make it a bit more performance oriented and a little bit better if it comes to the quality of outputs. But you'll find it as well below the video in the link inside of our Voice AI community. You can literally download this thing for free and just leverage it for yourself as you follow along. So I recommend just pausing the video here, grabbing the template, downloading it, and then following along. Now, once you've downloaded the template, all you would basically do is just create a new workflow. I have basically one called here, Brain MCP. You literally just create a similar one. It doesn't need to be called the same way. It can be called whatever you want, and you just import the template, and it will look something like this. So this is literally a template that is very similar. Literally, I would say, visually at least exactly the same as it is inside of the n8n template. So you will see nothing else but this, which seems a little bit overwhelming, but trust me, it isn't. First of all, I'm going to show you how you can set it up with minimal friction. And at the end, if you want, I give you some more explanations, so you really understand what this whole template does, so you get a better feeling on how you can really customize it. Now, the only things we really need to look into is connecting the dots, or basically connecting the accounts that are related to it, so we can make it work. And the major thing that basically initiates this whole thing as an MCP server is this module right here. It's available in n8n by default, so you have the n8n workflows MCP server, and it is connected to a couple of workflows. The good thing is nothing needs to be adjusted here. This thing is already ready out of the box. However, what you need to do to make it work is you need to connect a memory. And this is a Redis memory, which you can set up depending on the platform fairly easily. If you use Render, for example, render.com or railway.app, they have predefined setups for getting Redis up and running, which is very, very easy. And if you host your n8n on Render as well, you can use the direct local connection to get a super quick response from within Render without ever leaving your local network. Now, this is a bit more complex and it's a bit more performance oriented, but if you stay until the end of the video, I'm also going to show you how you can actually connect your own Redis server to that as well, because it's just a little extra to make sure you really don't get stuck with just a thing like the memory. Now, once you've did that, you also need to set up your API key inside of the n8n API, because what this does is it basically uses its own API. So you basically have an API that talks with its own n8n instance to do certain things, to get information. Like here, basically it searches for workflows that are tagged with MCP, because that's a way on how we give it access to certain tools. This is something you gotta set up once here and once here. And once you have done that, I think you are pretty much done. You basically connect the same Redis nodes right in here with the same credentials like this one. And you also need to connect the OpenAI chat model. So this means you need to have an OpenAI account with a OpenAI API key, which when you click on it, you can basically add it here, or basically just go here and click on create new credential, add it there, and you're ready to go as well with having n8n as an MCP server. So the whole setup is fairly easy. And if you want to see an end-to-end setup where I really set up this whole system from scratch using Render, so literally setting up n8n, setting up Redis, setting up anything else that is relevant like the database, please let me know and I'll make sure I record a video about that as well, so you know exactly how you can replicate the whole setup without trying to figure out things yourself. Now, once you've adjusted that, you're literally ready to go. You can just save this template and you can activate it. And what that means is now you can actually go into Cursor and set up the extras right there, because that is basically the connection that we need to connect Cursor to our n8n MCP server, even though it has no utility yet, but we can already connect it. Now, I'm gonna show you exactly how to do that, and trust me, it is fairly easy. Now, to get this whole thing connected with Cursor or with any kind of local IDE or wherever you wanna use the MCP server with, you need to obviously define in that MCP configuration that this is a server that you can talk to. And in Cursor, it works via their settings. So if you head into Cursor, you go to settings, and then you will see here, tools and integrations. You simply go on there. They might be moving it around. Initially, it was somewhere else. Now it's under tools and integrations, but you get the gist of it. You just search for MCP server and you'll find something. So you will not have this entry right here, but that is the one we are going to add. And to add it, all you do is you click here on new MCP server, which then opens a file that looks something like this. Now, when you set it up, there's only two things you need to adjust. And the first one is obviously the MCP remote right here. This is the one that you will find inside of the MCP server trigger right here. So if you double click this module, you will find here in the test URL and production URL, the actual URL you do copy. So you literally just copy that one and you're going to paste it into the MCP configuration. Once you've replaced this URL, you also need to add the authentication token, which is basically your API key for n8n, so you can actually talk with it. And to do that, you literally just head over into n8n. You go down here on settings, and within the settings, you will find API keys. You create an API key for as long as you need it. So if you say, I would generally recommend expiring those keys, but if you know you're never going to share it and you want to make things work on a constant basis without ever renewing the key, you can also set it for infinite or forever. But that's just something that's a bit more risky, right? Because if you ever expose that key, other people could potentially just interact with your n8n, which isn't something you really want. So make sure you keep those keys private. Now, once you copy that key, all you do is you head back into the mcp.json file and you replace the auth token right here that is within these two double quotes. So you need to have the double quotes at the beginning, at the end, very important. You just paste the key that you copied right within here. Once you've done that, all you need to do is you simply save that file. And when you head back over to Cursor, you will now see that it says loading tools. And if everything works out, you will be able to see the tools connected to your MCP server. And when that's the case, congratulations, you now literally established a connection with your MCP server using server sent events. Server sent events is a method that is currently deprecated by the MCP protocol, but don't worry about that. Deprecated doesn't mean it's gone. It's just something that they haven't adjusted yet, but it is something that we can most likely adjust in the future inside of these n8n MCP triggers. I assume once it is implemented, we will see a field right in here. So then you can basically just switch to the newer version of the server sent events, which is streaming. So it's HTTP streaming, and this will just make that whole process a little bit smoother and offer you a couple of more options. So that is just something I want you to keep in mind because MCP still is evolving. Once it is connected, you will see a little green dot right here and it says 5 tools enabled, which is perfect because those 5 tools basically represent these 5 tools right in here. And there is a bit of a difference that you need to understand because these tools are not the actual tools that are being called within the MCP tool set. So this is another thing that we're going to set up now, which is basically configured in this workflow right here. So these ones are basically to enable certain tools, and this one is the one to run the tools. And for now, let's for example say we want to create a tool and add it to the MCP server itself, because this MCP server has no tools by default. Now I already added a tool here, which is why I can basically see the tool, and I can see that as well by going for example into here and asking it, please show me the current available tools. So I'll just send that, and it's now basically using the list tool function. You can see that right here. And when that returns it, you can see it just says get cat joke because there's only a single tool connected, because that is something I enabled inside of my Cursor setup. Now heading back into the workflow, how can I actually make this work? Obviously, we need to have a workflow that we want to call within that MCP server. That is where all of the magic happens. That's basically the workflow that adds the extra utility you want to get certain information out of n8n into your agentic IDE, where you can basically just use that information and leverage for extra tasks. Now, in my case, I literally just used it for this cat joke example because it's very easy to set up and easy to understand. And to do that, I'm just gonna go here to my productivity tab, and you will see here I have another workflow called get cat joke. I'll just open that, and within here, these are literally the only tasks that I have. You can see it says when executed by another workflow. All I did in here is I basically just added a custom cat name. So this is a variable, and whatever you add in here is basically going to be used as a parameter inside of the MCP server. So when the MCP server fetches the tools, you can see that right here, it basically responds, you can see with the ID, the name, the description, the parameters, and in the parameter you can see it has cat name, which is the reference to the field that I use in here as an input schema for this workflow. So this is the way on how we define the parameters for the MCP tool that you're going to use. Now, these tools are then being used right within here to basically just take the cat name, do a chat completion, and then store the information in a response variable. And I just see I have like a little grammar mistake right here. But what it does is you can see it stores it in a response, and it just takes the content, saves it, and that is basically being returned within the MCP server, as you can see right here. So it's very, very basic. It's very simple. You would then basically, whenever you execute it, return that information, and that is what is available right here. So you can see response. So this response key basically just references to the response key that is defined in here. So this is a way on how we can now use these tools without ever touching the main MCP workflow that we just set up and we configured to actually execute workflows that we would like. Now, first of all, let's for example say you have 100 or 200 workflows on your n8n account, and you don't want all of them to be available inside of the MCP setup or where MCP can basically access them. And this is a way that that n8n inside of the template, they have limited that by tags, which means that I can literally just go in here and I can basically add a tag called MCP, which means that now this scenario or this tool will be available when I search or when I try to add it from within all of the available workflows. That's just like an extra little security thing, so that the MCP setup that we created, or that n8n created in this case, doesn't have access to your whole setup of workflows, but only to the ones that are tagged MCP. It just makes the list shorter, leaner, and you get probably a better outcome when trying to add them. Now, adding the tools is a whole nother story, which I'm going to show you now, because now you have basically created this. This is, by the way, also as a template inside of the resource hub, so you'll find that as well in the same file. But let's, for example, say you added that here as well, you saved it, you tagged it as MCP. Now there is still one more step that we need to do, and that is to copy the ID of the workflow. And how can you get the ID of the workflow? The easiest thing is literally just heading up here in the URL, and you copy the ID behind /workflow/. This is literally the ID of the workflow that you're going to use if you want to enable it within the MCP server itself. Because now it's tagged, now it's available. Now we just need to make sure it is actually active so we can use it inside of our IDE. Now, once you copy that, all you do is you basically head over into your agentic system where you have connected the MCP server to. So in my case, Cursor. And now if I would like to add this workflow with a cat jokes to the actual MCP configuration, so it is active, I can basically just tell it to add this workflow to the n8n MCP server. And since I've already added it, as you can see here, we basically retrieved the list. I'm going to show it to you first in an example by removing it. And the way I would do is I would basically say, please remove the following workflow from the n8n MCP server. Boom, the ID in here. I'll just press enter. And as you can see, it now tries to call remove workflow with this workflow ID. So if I run this tool, it's basically removing the workflow from the database where we pre-stored these things in Redis. That's basically the storage where we just store the connection of which tools are active. And you can see it removed one tool. And now if I ask it, now please list the tools again. So if it's listing the tools, the available tools again, you will now see that there is no tool available because we removed it, right? So if I run this tool, you can now see that nothing is being returned because there's no tool. And now I can, for example, say, please add this tool again. So now it basically tries to add the workflow again with the ID that we had previously. I just run that and you can see that the tool has been added and now I basically have access to it again. This is a way on how you can control which tools are actually being used inside of the MCP server, which is great if you want to run really cool automations. And obviously this is more of a proof of concept. You can make this a lot more dynamic, or let's for example say you always have the same kind of tools available. You can also just configure them inside of the Brain MCP right here by just preloading them, for example, into the Redis cache. So you can cache them and store them. This is another option that you have. There are tons of ways on how you can customize that, but that is a very basic setup that allows me at least to just control this whole thing a little bit more granularly on Cursor itself without building out a lot of extra logic right in here that might not even be relevant to you. So this is basically the whole setup on how you can make or how you can turn n8n into an MCP server, which is incredible for so many reasons. First, because now you can literally just create visual workflows without any intermediate solution to use n8n as an MCP server in agentic systems. And the second thing that is really cool is that now this is basically on a server-sent event setup, meaning you have immediate responses. So it is a lot quicker than spinning up an extra environment all the time. That might take you 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds a minute. I've literally seen all of these numbers, which is terrible for performance, especially if you use it for voice AI. So this is a game changer for your productivity because now you can actually add really delegated and tailored utility specifically for your use case to leverage n8n in a way that is better than ever. Now, in the next step, it's going to be a little bit more technical because I'm going to guide you through how this setup is actually set up so you understand how it works, which I think is crucial that you really understand how you need to customize things if something goes wrong or you want to add extra utility. And that is something that I want to make sure I cover because it is super powerful if you want to build really sophisticated solutions, either for your business or for the clients that you're serving with the solutions you're building. Now, n8n has luckily already structured things here in a very visual way, which is great. And I'm going to start out actually with this module right here because it's the testing module. You have this chat bubble available inside of your n8n module, inside of your n8n scenario once you import it. And you can literally just talk to it. And it basically uses some in-store memory to basically interact with the MCP server so that you can test whether or not these things are actually working. Now, this is something that is great for debugging. So let's, for example, say you play around with it. You can literally just talk to it and it's basically executing the agentic system and it's then using the n8n MCP server to do certain things, which is really, really cool and works pretty well. So that is something on how you can test things. But the majority of things that I want you to understand is how the connection between any local agentic system that leverages MCP to this MCP server actually works and how it executes workflows. So to make this very easy to understand, we simply head over into Cursor because if I now click here on tools enabled, you will see these available tools. It says basically execute tool, search tool, list tool, remove tool, and add workflow. Now you can see that these tools will differ a little bit from what is visually available inside of n8n because here, for example, says execute tool, but when we head into our n8n, you can see it says execute workflow. So there is a bit of a mismatch, which might be confusing, but when you actually open this execute workflow module, you can see that the name itself is called execute tool. And this is basically the one that you see inside of Cursor as well. And from within here, you basically define the workflow ID of the current workflow and as an operation, the execute workflow operation, because this is then being used whenever the MCP server is called, and this is basically being triggered. It just sets the operation to execute workflow, which is then being used with a sub workflow. So this is basically just triggering its own workflow to execute this workflow from another trigger. And here you have this if statement, which does nothing else than exactly check against these kind of value. So you can see here, for example, it says execute workflow, which is the same setup that you have seen inside of this submodule of the n8n MCP server. So this is the connection. You basically have the tool name. This is being called within the MCP server. It goes into here. It sets up all the variables. It calls itself based on this trigger, and then it runs through here and does certain operations. And you can see you have 5 of them available here. Same ones that you had seen in cursor. Add workflow, remove workflow, list workflow. So it basically does the same thing. And these features up here are literally just there for managing the currently active workflows. That's basically what I showed you with which ones of the ones that are tagged with the MCP tag are actually being actively used in the current agent. So this is literally just to configure whatever is being stored inside of the Redis cache. And then the last one, this is the major one. This is where the magic happens of executing sub workflows. And this is a very thought through system that n8n actually provided, which is really, really cool. But the main thing happens in this module right here, which is executing the actual workflow that is currently being triggered. Because now since we stored the configurations in Redis, we also have the connection to the actual workflow that is being called. So let's, for example, say we list the tools. You can see in here, it basically just takes the JSON that was stored in the memory and it basically returns the currently active tools, right? So in our case, it has been the cat tool, for example, that we just added, right? So there's one available that's stored in here and it's basically being returned when we want to list it. So we can literally just access it and use it from within the MCP server, which then contains the workflow ID that I've shown you earlier as well. So you can see here, for example, we added it, right? So it's basically being added. And if we want to call it, let's just go up to actual call parameter where we just call it, not the list tools one. I think I already removed it, but there's basically one where it says execute tool and the execute tool sends in the parameters and it sends in another parameter called workflow IDs. And this workflow ID is then basically being used right within this module over here to execute this sub workflow with the parameters that were provided. Really, really handy, right? You can see that as well here. It basically says workflow IDs. So this just pastes in the ID, which is then being used to execute any kind of sub workflow. So if I, for example, say I want to have a random cat joke, which we're going to walk through now, please take the cat jokes tool with the name Adam. So now I just execute that and I want it to execute the tool. You can see now in here, it sends the parameters, cat name Adam and the workflow IDs. This is basically the available tool that we connected. I run this tool and what happens now is that it literally just calls that through the MCP server. So basically through here, it goes to execute workflow. It executes this one. This one runs over here through operations down here, get the parameters, and then executes this module, which then again executes the other workflow, which is right here, get cat jokes. This is where the magic happens. We just store it as a response, and this response again is being parsed back into the tool call result, which is then being used for memory inside of your agentic system. I hope that makes sense. It seems a bit more complicated, but I hope I explained it simple enough so you can follow along on how that actually works. And now as the last goodie, I'm going to show you how you can actually set up Redis locally in Render when you have your n8n setup hosted in Render as well, because the local configuration is what makes this thing so powerful, because you don't need to send over the information of that Redis cache to some other setup, but you can actually keep it right inside of your local environment. And how we can do that is very easy. You first of all log into Render, which brings you to a page like this. From here, you go basically at the top right to new. So you add a new service. There's a couple of buttons, so you will definitely find that somewhere on the Render page. And here you click on key value, which brings you to a window that looks something like this. This is basically the Redis storage where we store the information from within that MCP server, which workflows are active. So I would probably just name that something like n8n-redis, just like as a standard storage name. Then you can define where you'd like to have it. You can host it in Frankfurt. I love Frankfurt, as you can see on my test account right here, because it is very centralized and it can access multiple places around the world. Obviously, if you set that up for a client, choose one that location matches the client. But apart from that, you can just leave most of the rest by default. I'll just choose the free one because I just want to show it to you now. And then I just click on create key value instance. What happens now is I basically have the name already used. So I just add Redis-1 and I create key value instance. What happens now is it basically just creates that server for me. And I will see in a second a couple of fields right here, which are very, very easy to configure and use. So once this is ready, I'll be back and show you the rest of the setup inside of n8n. Once your Redis setup is ready, you will see here status available, which means everything was successful. You now have a successful Redis instance in place. In this specific configuration I'm going to show you shows you the local use of n8n and Redis being in the same environment, meaning that if you host your n8n or render in Europe, so let's say Frankfurt for example, and you also have Redis in Frankfurt, which obviously makes sense that you have both in the same kind of space, then you can use a very, very, very basic setup with Redis that basically leverages Redis directly through n8n, but on the local instance. So it's not sending the information back and forth between some web requests, but it's actually doing it locally. So it's incredibly, incredibly fast. And to do that, it's fairly easy. You simply scroll down here, you go to internal key value URL. You don't copy the full one, you just copy this part right here. And now what you do is you basically head over to the Brain MCP scenario, so the one that you created earlier. And now you click here on any of those Redis modules. You click down here on the dropdown, you say create new credentials. I'll just call the Redis account 2. And what I'm going to do is you can basically leave password and user empty. And all you do is you change localhost to the one that you actually copied, and you remove the port at the very end with a colon. And now if I click save, you will see that it automatically connects. Boom, so connection tested successfully, and you're literally ready to go. Now I can just go into the other Redis module. So I'm just going to delete it for now. But I would basically just go into the other Redis module that you will see right over here, and you select the same credentials that you've added, and this is literally all you need to do. There's nothing else to the Redis setup if you use it locally on render. If you don't use it locally on render, there's another option which I'm going to show you now. And to make that work, you would basically need to add your access control down here with the IP that you're using for your server. So let's, for example, just say I'm just going to use a local one that doesn't really exist, just for the sake of testing and showing you. I'm just going to save that. And you will now see, since we've added that, we can go up here on connect, external, and here you will see the username separated by a colon, and then you basically have the password, right? And you just copy that inside of the user and password fields alongside with the actual name that you will find here as well. So this is basically kind of the same name that you will use inside of the Redis setup so that you can communicate with it from another external service, which works as well, but keep in mind that the response in between will be a few milliseconds slower. Now, given that, I really hope this gives you a better picture of why I think this is such a powerful setup, because now you can literally just turn anything into an MCP server using your n8n setup that you have hosted anyway somewhere. So you can leverage that in the craziest possible ways that you can imagine. And obviously you can make things a lot more dynamic as well by just adding extra values into it. For example, to get extra memory based on where you call in from, some extra additional values that you can validate against it, to have multiple Redis caches. So there's tons of stuff you can do with it. And it's just incredibly powerful because now you can tailor workflows to execute things for you inside of your agentic system. This is going to be a game changer, and I see this in the future one of the major things that will make a big difference. And now, as I promised at the very end, you get some extra goodie, which is basically referring to the next video I'm creating for you, which is leveraging this setup for voice AI agents. As until now, we never really used MCP for voice AI agents because it was fairly limited or really, really slow. Any kind of MCP service that you needed to integrate with, they had features that you didn't want, they had tools you didn't want, you always manually had to deactivate them. It was a really big pain and nothing that really was great or a great experience for the clients too. But now, since we can connect things like n8n to it as an MCP server, the doors are open to create the most insane solutions. So stay tuned and already leverage that for yourself. I'm also going to link a link below the video that brings you to this whole community page where you see some extra goodies along the way that help you already get a bit of a better understanding how to leverage that for voice AI. So definitely check it out. And that's all from my side for now. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.